Hey, good morning. I'm Brian Reynolds. I'm going to go ahead and start the session. I know we are off on time a little bit, and we have about 45 minutes to cover a good bit of material. I'm going to talk to you all today about Lean and Agile and its application within the IT modernization process. Before we get started, I'll tell you a little bit about me so you know who's talking at you over the next 45 minutes. I'm from Virginia. I've got 4 kids. The oldest is 20. The youngest is 15 months. So while I'm not lean, I am agile, whether I want to be or not every day. As a hobby, I work on old motorcycles. It's an old 1965 Honda that I finished last year. I love national parks. And I've spent most of my career, since 1990, doing software development or systems integration work in one capacity or another. Probably the same trajectory as a lot of you, software developer, then a task lead, then a PMO lead, et cetera. The last 5 years probably, I've spent most of my time helping organizations get better at Agile. And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. I currently lead about 9 projects in the federal government, and our role is delivery of large systems at scale, using Agile. And so we'll sort of talk through some of those lessons learned. They're not all fun lessons, but I think they're good lessons, and that I'd like to share as we go through this. So as we chat today, we're going to kind of cover 2 or 3 things here, principally. We're going to talk about Agile. We're going to do just a brief coverage of Agile so that we're all on the same page about what I'm talking about. We're going to talk about the similarities between Agile and Lean, and you'll find that the ideas and the objectives are amazingly aligned. There's very little in Agile or in Lean that you won't find in the other model. They're very complementary. It's a matter of, we often say think Agile, but you're effectively saying think Lean when you say that to folks. We'll talk about how thinking Lean really does affect value delivery, which is our primary objective with both Agile and Lean. How that lean thinking really does improve your ability to deliver value. And then we're going to walk through just 5 sort of key concepts, real world things you can think about doing on your projects that will really drive lean ideas and lean objectives. And those really are better value, less work in process, right? Better quality. Those are the sort of main things we're trying to get to here with Lean. And this is often accomplished in Lean through the removal of non-value-added activities, what we call MUDA, waste. So those are the sort of 4 things we're trying to get to. But before we start talking about Lean, let's talk a little bit about Agile. This is a process that differs from the techniques, at least that I used for an awful lot of my early career anyway. This is a departure from what we would call the predictive or plan-driven software development or software delivery. We now are implementing a learning system, and it's like most complex things in life. You need iteration, you need feedback, you need to learn lessons to get it right, especially if it's a large, complicated endeavor. The idea, I think, that this is all based on is that it's folly to think that we can build precise plans and estimates on an imprecise set of requirements. At the beginning of a process when we know less than we'll know at any other time in the process, right? So we're not suggesting with this model that you're less rigorous or you do less planning or you're less thoughtful about how you manage and deliver your projects. What we are suggesting is you do it a little bit at a time. And we'll talk about the importance of release planning as we get through move through the materials, but that's really a core, concept here. The idea is we're still going to build a plan. We're just going to do it a little at a time. We're going to pivot based on what we learn and what our changing priorities are, and we're going to, most importantly, we're going to deliver value, and we're going to measure value as working software every step of the way. The way this process works is we're going to have a product backlog. Right? If we're talking about team level Agile, we're going to have a product backlog. It's a list of the things we may do. Right? It's the things we may implement, not that we will implement. We progressively elaborate that backlog, meaning we have a very broad definition, coarse-grained definition of what those requirements are, of what that work is. And as those items become a priority and they become a work that we are about to take on, we disaggregate those features or those large coarse-grained definitions of requirements or capabilities into sprintable units of work, stories. In a 2-week sprint, it has to be a story that I can finish or the team can finish within the 2-week period of time, right? And we're going to talk about the importance of small stories in a few minutes. And this corollary to sort of lean manufacturing would be the idea of small batch sizes. And I'll demonstrate to you why you can deliver more value or how you can deliver more value with small batch sizes. The idea here is we have this product backlog. That backlog, we determine what set of those priorities we can deliver over the next time box, over the next sprint. We base that on our team's demonstrated capacity to deliver. So it's just like a production line. I know how much my production line is capable of, how many widgets I can produce in a given time period. That's how much work I would plan, how many widgets I'd plan to build. And it's the same idea here. We're going to come to an understanding through a few sprints of what our team's capacity to deliver is. We're going to plan that much work. We're going to estimate how much work that is out of our backlog. We're going to plan that work in, and we're going to collaboratively deliver the solution. By collaboratively, I mean the developer's not going back into a back room. They are working and collaborating with the product owner, oftentimes with the government or the government's representative, to make sure that questions are answered, the intent is clarified, and that we get to a product that is fit for use, fit for purpose. Right? We're gonna execute this sprint within a fixed time box. We're not going to stretch the time box if we don't get the work done. We're not going to take credit for doing work that we've partially done. So we have to complete it. It has to be acceptable by our product owner, by the government, by the state, and then we'll take credit for delivering that value. And we'll talk about where we count value delivered as we get through this a little bit. Value delivery in this model is not review with the product owner, right? It shouldn't be. It needs to be delivery to the end user, right? That's when you get past having WIP. Until then, you have a lot of investment, you have a lot of effort, but you don't have any value being delivered to your customer, right? So we're going to talk about not just the sprint process today, but the underlying infrastructure that needs to be in place and the processes that need to be in place to make this work. Ultimately, we deliver a product, and that product is working software. And the wonderful thing about this model is you know pretty quickly whether your vendor is competent. Not competent at building documents, but competent at building a solution that works, competent at working with you to figure out the right solution. So we have iteration, we have feedback, we have working software as value. These are the sort of core concepts here. We have low WIP, right? We don't take on more work than we can plan to deliver. So these are all lean ideas. They are all central to how we go about doing Agile. These values are based on a few very important things. Individuals and interactions. So we're going to give up the idea of long specifications, but we have to replace that with something, and that's conversation and collaboration, direct involvement between our product owners and our Agile team. Right? Can't give up one thing and not replace it with something else and think we're going to have success. It's not going to work. Working software is how we're going to determine and measure our value. Right? Customer collaboration is key. Responding to change is absolutely expected in this model. We are recognizing that we don't know it all up front, that we're going to see how something works, see how something is implemented, and we're going to pivot on that. And we may decide that some things that we thought were absolutely a priority, they aren't as time goes on. And then we may find there are some things in our product backlog that never are valuable enough to be built in front of some other things in front of your backlog, right? We're always going to build those things that are most valuable. So lean, there's 3 key elements. This is based upon the Toyota Production System. There's philosophy, there's tools and practices, and there's managerial role. This is one of many well-proven manufacturing concepts that have direct applicability in the software development space. Others might include TQM, just-in-time, the theory of constraints. They all are Six Sigma. They all are aimed at, in my way of thinking, at 3 key things. Improving value delivery or improving throughput, reducing operating expenses, and improving ROI. We improve ROI by reducing the amount of WIP we have, the amount of money and time we spent on items that we haven't delivered and aren't giving value to the customer. So if you look at this philosophy, customer first, and that's about maximizing value, that's absolutely what we're doing in Agile, right? We are always prioritizing that backlog to deliver those things that are most valuable to our customer. People are our most valuable resource. We plan our work at a sustainable pace in Agile, right? We deliver our work at a pace that our team can sustain, and they can sustain high quality of the products with, right? So there's absolute corollaries here. Continuous improvement. With Agile, at the end of every sprint, we run a retrospective. We figure out and talk about what didn't go well, what could have gone better, how can we make this process better? Absolutely in line with the ideas of continuous improvement and Kaizen out of the performance improvement and process improvement work. Shop floor focus. The idea here is if you want to be on the floor, if you want to improve the way a manufacturing process works, get on the floor where the work's being done. That's exactly the same philosophy we take with coaching, for example. We're not going to coach and improve the Agile process sitting behind a desk or in an office. We're going to get out there with the teams. Our coaches have to be involved. They have to be experiencing what's working and what's not to improve the process. Tools and practices, just in time. Right? We've talked about with Agile, we're going to capacity plan our work. We're going to schedule the work that we believe we can get done. And in time, we'll have a better and better understanding of what can be done, and we can incent some performance improvements. One way we can really incent performance improvement is reduction in defects. If you think about the types of work that we all do, there's work that's sort of business-oriented, there's work that's technical, there are changes, and there are unplanned work. Unplanned work delivers no value, right? That is correction of work or value you've already taken credit for delivering, but now have found you have a problem with. That's time and energy and money that you're spending to fix something that wasn't done right the first time. That same time, energy, and money could be spent delivering new value, that is new features to your customers. So we really do want to focus on better quality, and just in time we don't want to take on more than we can sustain, right? If we can't deliver it at a sustainable pace, quality is going to go down. These two things are related. And really importantly, develop people to improve performance. We are moving from command and control to a self-organized team, a team that plans together. It doesn't get a plan handed to them by a manager, and maybe their lifestyle's ruined by a lot of long hours and a lot of long days. We really are trying to create a sustainable place, a sustainable way of working where quality is possible. So these theories line up, I think, one for one with what we try to do and what we want to accomplish with Agile. This is I won't drain the slide. This is sort of a real comparison. I've kind of just walked through it. It's developing people to improve performance. The idea of self-organizing team, the idea of coaches, build in quality. The idea here is with Agile is testing is not a phase. Testing is not performed by a separate function. All right. Testing is part of the process that everybody on the team needs to be a part of. It's not something we want to put at the very end of the process when we've started to run out of time and energy and money, right? It's something we do every day. It's built in. As Demings would say, it's a built-in process. It's not something we're going to inspect into our process at the end of it. We're going to continually improve, and we'll talk about inspect and adapt metrics. And metrics are, I always say, it's hard to argue with math. And the idea here is that if we can demonstrate performance in numbers, then we can motivate improvements, and we can start to isolate where those improvements need to occur, right? It's not unlike the idea of Six Sigma that I want to understand, I want to remove process variability. The idea being if I have a standard process and I have things that aren't going well, if I have defects, if I have a standard process, I at least know where to make the fix. And I know that if I make that fix, it's going to have a consistent result across all the executions of that process, right? So we want to understand through metrics how to improve our process. Shop floor focus, again, is just the coaching, and just-in-time, capacity-based commitments, sustainable pace for our team is really important here. All right, so just an illustration of how we get to those ideas of better value, lower WIP, higher quality with Agile versus what might have been the model that certainly that I used and maybe that a lot of you all have used. You can see in this top model that we move through requirements, design, and this is a simplification, but the idea is we move through requirements, design, and even much of development, and we don't have any value delivered. If you looked at the ROI of this top part of this chart on a graph, you'd see ROI is negative on this project. You'd also see we don't have working software on which to derive feedback and to pivot and to improve, right? Whereas on the bottom, I'm delivering a little bit of value. The team's delivering a little bit of value every time. It's potentially shippable. We recognize that, especially at the beginning of a project, we don't immediately get to a place where we can deploy working and useful software. It just doesn't have the feature set required. But we're moving in that direction, right? And we're organizing our work so that we get to that place quickly. So we get to a minimally viable product as quickly as possible. We aren't waiting to the end of this process to integrate. And we'll talk about continuous integration in a few minutes. But the idea here is we're going to integrate continually. We're going to test continually. We're going to build in quality. And we're going to have demonstratable software at the end of every one of these sprints. Right? Low WIP. Right? We've capacity planned the work we're taking on. We're not having WIP build across our process here. We're delivering that WIP quickly. So, this is the business case for Agile. I'm reducing my risk because I'm using feedback to learn more about what my customer needs earlier in the process. Correcting a problem earlier in the process is always cheaper. It's always cheaper. I've got less investment, less WIP tied up in that, maybe that wrong supposition, right? So this is the business case for Agile, and this is the business case for that Lean makes too. This is why we approach Lean. So there are 8 wastes that we look at in Lean manufacturing, and this is a convenient acronym for them, downtime. There's a number of others, but this is the one I think, at least it's easiest for me to remember. It's a word. And you can see on the other side of the chart here, we show you the corollaries between the kind of waste you might see in a manufacturing setting and the kind of waste you see in a software development process, and how Agile provides mechanisms to address this. We look at defects. We use test-driven development. We write our test and build our software to our tests, right? So we understand and get to a place where we have test software that meets our criteria for acceptance. We collect metrics, so we understand what our defect rates are, what our defect densities are. So we understand how we have a pretty good understanding of how much unplanned work we have, right? Overproduction. We're going to talk about release planning. We understand what we need to release or include within our release, and that's what we build. And we don't build anything else, right? We figure out what we can build, what our team has the capacity to build, what's useful, what provides value, and that's what we focus on. We don't focus on anything that doesn't contribute to that release. Waiting. The idea here is that I've got folks that are waiting for a good build or for something else so they can do their job. The idea in Agile is we aspire to have T-shaped individuals on our teams. By T-shaped individuals, I mean we have folks who have a deep specialization. It might be in testing, it might be in UX, it might be in the database, but they also they can be put to work in a general sense, helping the rest of the team. It's a self-organizing team, so you have a built of specialists who have the ability to help across a number of disciplines. So we're not waiting, right? We can put people to work on a number of different things. Non-utilized talent is sort of the same ideas here. Transportation. So the idea in manufacturing would be there's a lot of waste in moving a half-built product from one place to another, right? We have we address the same concept when we talk about continuous integration in a little bit. We'll talk about the idea of smoke testing and testing in stages so that we identify where a product has defects, where it can and cannot be included within the build. And we do that early and quickly and in stages so that we can identify quickly whether or not software should be moved on to the next stage of testing and the next stage of deployment. Inventory, it's the idea of small batches. And extra processing, we've already talked about sort of the idea of a release plan. And importantly, the idea of a definition of ready and a definition of done. And we use these two concepts. They're important. Definition of ready is that criteria that's required for me to schedule a story into a sprint, right? Before I am going to commit a story to a sprint or forecast a story into a sprint and work on it, it has to have certain criteria. It has to have acceptance criteria. It has to have a persona-based statement of requirement. It has to have the agreement between not only the product owner but the development team that they understand the intent. They've had a conversation and they agree, they understand the intent of what has to be built, right? Same thing on definition of done. I have criteria here that says this is what has to happen for me to accept a story. It has to pass a certain number of tests. It has to have had a peer review. It has to be demonstrated, right? So there are criteria here. It's rigorous. It's not, it's not this notion that we're abandoning rigor is a falsity. All right, so we've sort of laid out the similarities between the two models. And what I would like to do now is just sort of spend a few minutes talking about 5 practices that are key. These are just 5 practical tactics to keep in mind as you try to achieve Lean's objectives through Agile. And I'd say these tactics, a lot of them are not just good for and support Agile development, but in fact are, I believe, key to the notion of Agile acquisition or modular acquisition. And I'll sort of point those out as we kind of move through the process. The first one is to deliver small vertical stories. And we talked about small batches here. This is a different way of thinking, I think, and this is where a lot of challenges occur in my clients anyway, is the idea of a vertical story. And the way I always explain it is, this is doesn't look like a very tasty cake, but it's a cake, right? We make a cake in layers, right? And when do you get to eat the cake? When all the layers are done and it's all put together, and then you can finally get the value out of that cake. You can finally see that it's good or not. Well, we don't want to work that way, right? There's a couple reasons we don't work that way, because if we make some bad assumptions on that first layer or that second layer, by the time we figure it out, we've got a lot of rework, all right? We want to build in slices. We want to build vertically. We want to have a potentially shippable product feature here that includes enough of the UX, enough of the business logic, enough of the database, enough of the middleware that we can deliver a workable feature or demonstratable feature to our customer. And we want to build upon that idea, right? And there's a couple, there's lots of ways of doing this. Implementing a simple workflow or a happy path type workflow, and in the next sprint, implementing a more complicated workflow. It could be implementing your log on screen in the first sprint, and in the next sprint, some of the business rules around the complexity of the password, right? There's lots of ways we can split and build our stories so that we get to a place where we have something demonstratable to our customer, where a customer can see the value. It could be a screen where I look up records. In the first sprint, I might provide the lookup function and just a statement saying returns 500 records. In the next sprint, I provide a grid that delivers those 500 records for their viewing and click through, right? So there's lots of ways we can think about our stories. The idea here is we want to get to something that's demonstratable, right? The other thing we want to make sure we do is we want to make sure they're small. And I sort of proved this point with a simple model, but I think it makes sense to you. This is based on Little's Law, and the idea is that if I have more WIP, for example, more customers in my store, and I can process them or serve them at the same rate, on average, the lead times are going to go up, right? You've probably experienced this when you've gone into a store and you've seen a big long line. People are working at the same pace they've always worked at, and you get through there way slower if there's a lot of people than if there isn't. It's the same idea with our stories in Agile here. The idea here is at the bottom, I'm showing you that if I have a throughput rate, 4.8 points a day, I have a 10-day sprint, and my team can deliver on average about 48 points per sprint. They can deliver about 4.8 points per day, and so that's our throughput rate. If I start with a story, or an average story sizes of 32, all right, I can deliver basically a story every 6.7 days, all right? That means that within a 10-day sprint, I can deliver 1.5 stories. But in Agile, we don't take credit for half stories. We don't take credit for half done work, right? So basically, what I get to deliver, what my throughput is with that large WIP size, is one story, one 32-point story. I have 16 points of incomplete work. That's WIP. That's money I've spent that I can't deploy, that is delivering no value to my end user, right? Same amount of work, same throughput rate with small batches, 8-point stories. I can deliver a story every about 1.7 days. I can deliver 6 of those stories. I'm doing the same amount of work, but I'm delivering 48 points worth of value here, and I have no WIP. Right? It's the same idea as if I had shampoo bottles, large batch. I got to the end of a production run, and I've only filled half of a batch. I don't deliver any of the batch, right? It's all held up. Right? It's the same idea here. We're not delivering the value of that shampoo. We're not able to deliver as much value. So this is an example of how organizing around small vertical stories gets you to a place where you can deliver more value without doing more work. It's an important concept. It's about reducing cycle times on our stories, right? All right, let's talk about release plans. Release plans are absolutely core, and as we think about not just delivery but acquisition, this is the mechanism to execute modular acquisition, right? In my opinion, right? With a release plan, I can get to a performance measurement baseline. I can get to a place where I know what stories I'm building, I know in what sprints by what teams I'm delivering them in, and I can get to cost. I have the 3 baselines I need to manage the project and do something that's, some people don't think is advisable, but in the government is often required, which is earned value. Right? I can get to a place where I can actually track earned value during my release. It's key to maximizing value, right? I have a clear plan about what I'm going to deliver in the next release. It's based on my team's capacity. I'm not going to work on anything that's not in that release. I'm not going to have stories at the end that are unfinished that I have to move into the next sprint or into the next release, hopefully. And I'm not going to have a lot of inventory. I'm not going to have a lot of WIP. So the ideas here are based on just Agile planning. So especially Agile planning at scale, we're going to plan at 5 different levels. It's important that we understand what our product vision is, right? So we know what we're building, why we're building it, and that we have a high-level idea in this vision about what makes this product, what makes it successful or acceptable, right? That gets everybody on the same page about where we're all heading, about the intent of this initiative, right? Then we build a roadmap. Essentially, a roadmap is a list of features laid into time boxes, and the upcoming or the nearest term time box, we want to make sure those features are essentially commitments about what we're going to deliver. The next couple of time boxes on that roadmap are ambitious. They're our ambitions, but they're subject to change. We're going to return to this road mapping process at the end of every release or concurrent with every release. So we'll be revising that roadmap on a rolling basis. We take the features that are planned into the first part of our roadmap, we build a release plan, and I'll show you a slide or two about this in just a moment. That release plan it defines what we're going to do at a story level. This is important, at a story level, and this is just my own personal experience that if you don't do this at a story level, you inevitably get to a place where you plan features into a release, and your feature estimates, which are based on an aggregate definition of a coarse grain requirement, inevitably end up being, the stories actually end up being a lot bigger than the feature, and it's usually not the other way around. So you get to a place where you start a release and you make a commitment about the release, but you don't really have a story level understanding of the work involved, right? So we want to get to a story level plan in our release plans. Then of course we have our regular sprint planning, our iteration planning, and then we have a daily stand-up. So we're planning at 5 different levels, and we're doing this iteratively, just like we're doing our development work iteratively. So this is sort of just the iteration. This graphic is sort of showing you how we might do this under the Scaled Agile framework model, where I have a innovation and planning sprint in which I build my release plan, then I execute, and then I conclude that what they call program increment, that certain set of sprints by doing my next release plan, right? You can do this without SAFe. We have teams that are building and planning the next release concurrently, right? And that's a key concept in at least how we advocate customers to handle agile acquisition, right? Get to a place where you fund the planning activity, maybe for the whole year, but when you get to the end of the release planning for the first release you're going to build, negotiate price, align a CLIN around that release, pay for the CLIN, all right? Have them plan the next release while they're building, and then you go through the same process again. This model does a couple of nice things for the government. It allows you to keep pricing pressure on your vendor. They haven't bid everything up front, and they're not change ordering you to death. It also allows you to collect performance data along the release delivery process. So when you come to the next negotiation around your next release, you can incent a little better performance, right? And you have a better understanding about how well they performed and whether or not they're sandbagging you on the price, right? Whether or not the price is a good one. So here's our release planning process. We're going to develop a backlog. We've talked about that. We're going to make an estimate of what those features are going to be. And those are just not only functional features, but technical or enablers. So there also needs to be consideration for the technical infrastructure and other technical work that needs to be done to enable a functional business solution to be put in place. And that has to be planned as part of this process. We then develop the roadmap. We plan the features into, and a lot of my clients do it on a quarterly basis. They'll set up their releases on a quarterly basis, and they'll, at this part of the process, they're going to say, they're basically saying, our planning, here's what I'm going to deliver in release 1. Pretty sure I can commit to that at this point. Here's what I aspire to deliver next. It's all based on value. It's all based on the customer's priority. It's all based on the customer's needs, right? It changes. We'll return to this process at the end of the release or towards the end of the release, and we'll reevaluate this for our next release. From that roadmap, we'll develop a release plan. So our release plan, our release is built by more than one sprint team. Each of those sprint teams have a capacity to deliver a certain type of work or a certain amount of work. And we know within the release they have a certain number of iterations or sprints on which to deliver it, right? So in this lower corner here, we're showing that we're going to schedule those features based upon dependencies, based upon the team's capacity to deliver. And finally, we develop an iteration plan. We break down those features into the stories that make up those features, and we double check. We say, do we still believe we can forecast delivery of this? If we can't, we make an adjustment now, so that so we know we have a plan that we have high confidence is achievable, right? At this point, when I get to this lower corner, I have a technical baseline. I know what I'm building. I know when I'm delivering it, which sprints and in which release. I know what team's delivering it, and I can get to cost. I can get to cost in one of two ways. If I have a contractor that has been already engaged for the whole year, and I know I've got 4 releases, I should have a stable team with Agile, right? My team shouldn't be changing. My operating expenses shouldn't be changing a whole lot. I can prorate the amount of money I allocate to this release, and I can derive the value of each one of those sprints to do things like earn value. Or I can contract on a release-by-release basis, right? So it supports both delivery and the acquisition model. So it's really a key concept here. It's I hope a demonstration that we need to get to some of these ideas around lean. We have to have rigorous planning. We just have to have iterative rigorous planning. So inspect and adapt and improve. So this is the idea of lean, of continuous improvement. Metrics are it's a two-edged sword. We want to build a team that is collaborative, self-organizing, committed to the same goal. We don't want functional silos, and so you have to be careful with metrics. Metrics are extremely useful, but they have to be used in the right way, right? I have clients, for example, that really focus on velocity. And velocity is, an estimate of how much work is being delivered, right? Not how much value is being delivered. They lose sight of value, and they end up focusing on points. It's a wrong focus, right? And then sometimes it does lead to a place where I get to the end of if I haven't done story level release planning, it gets to a place where I've delivered a lot of story points and a lot of stories, but I haven't delivered features. I haven't delivered something that's, deployable. So we got to be careful about how we use metrics. That said, we have found, especially within retrospectives, they are very useful. There's a variety of metrics depending on the customer and their concerns and where you see the process. But we generally rely on 5 key metrics. That's where we start when we drop into a project and start trying to figure out how to help them get better. One is productivity. It's a standard measure in Agile. It's velocity. It's like how much work is my team doing? And when we look at velocity, we don't just look at story points. We look at a couple of other things. We look at what part of those points are defects. That's a way for us to recognize unplanned work that could be used delivering value. The other thing we look at is split stories. It's important. If I have stories that I commit to in a given sprint but do not complete, which is my second measure there, predictability, that's sort of what I think of as a say-do ratio for the team. When I have split stories, I like to keep track of the split stories when I'm looking at velocity, because you can have teams that all of a sudden you see velocity spikes, but it's not because they got a lot better, it's because they got almost done with a lot of stuff last sprint, probably had really low velocity, and they had to do a few things to get it wrapped up, and all of a sudden velocity looks great. So you have to look at these measures together, and you have to make improvements to address both of them. Unplanned work, we've talked about that. We look at defect density. As we come out, if we find that our defects are being recognized after our sprint process, and particularly after the commit stage of our continuous integration process, and we start to we measure what percentage of our stories ended up having defects, and we look at a ratio of defect points to story points so that we can get an idea of whether or not we have a defect problem, an unplanned work problem, whether we have a quality problem. And there's practical answers to that. Oftentimes it means bringing some part of the testing function forward. It means changing your tests that are done in sprint so that they cover maybe commonly occurring issues. So there's a practical purpose for that, for these kind of measures. Integrity is test case coverage. We really do want to make sure as we go through commit stage of continuous integration and we get to a place where we put a story in front of our customer and says, this is ready. It's ready, it's done. We want you to review it. We think this is a done product. We want to make sure we're adequately testing those stories, right? It's a forward indicator of what will likely be defects that we discover down the road. So we do really look at test coverage. And the fifth measure is really important, deployable value. This is a measure of what value we've delivered, what features are complete. You know, did we complete all the features that we said we would deliver? And I have some clients who take two different approaches to this. I have a couple clients that actually assign points, two different types of points to their stories. They'll assign story points, an estimate of, an estimate of how much work is involved in that story. They also will assign value points on the same scale. It's a Fibonacci scale. So they have a much better, those that do that have a much better track record and ability to make a decision about what's most valuable and think about not just what's most valuable, but compare that to how much work is involved in delivering that value, right? So I may have two items that are equitable value. One's a lot less work than the other one. Do that one first, right? Lower the cycle times, get the value done quickly, right? So this is important. These other measures often they have to do with efficiencies in the process. Backlog dynamics is an interesting measure because inevitably we see our backlogs growing, and it's often difficult with a lot of agile lifecycle management tools. They're very good at telling you where you are right now, but looking back on time periods in the past to see what did my backlog look like before, and what does it look like now, and what's changed is very useful. You know, it helps you understand whether or not the backlog grew because the backlog was incomplete, or maybe I've had customers where you can see whole groups of stories, and we sometimes classify our stories around data or UX, et cetera. You can see if whole classes of stories are abandoned. It's a good indicator that the architecture was rethought in flight, and that there's a problem there with some of the upfront planning work that was done. So these measures all have various usefulness. You have to just be careful about how you use them. You can really undermine a team. You can get a team very stressed out. You can get a team very demoralized by using these metrics in the wrong way. The right place to use them is a retrospective, where the team is using them to improve the process, not in a managerial review where you're trying to evaluate how well the team's performing. Let the working software and completion of value be how you measure that. And that's a lesson I learned the hard way, to be frank. I didn't do that the right way the first time. Let's see. So I just want to tie back some of these measures to the lean objectives that we've talked about. You can see they all tie back pretty closely to those measures. And more than that, they tie back to where we're trying to get with all of this, which is improve our throughput, or the amount of value we're delivering, reduce our operating expenses, and reduce investment, reduce WIP. So they all drive back to those things. And I would tell you that, lean thinking would tell you that limiting operating expenses, there are some natural limits to how much you're going to be able to reduce operating expenses. And with a stable team, there's not a lot you can do, right, in Agile. The bounds for improving throughput are much greater, right? We can focus on a lot of different levers to improve throughput and value delivery. And so that's really where your focus should be, principally. All right, deployment pipeline. A lot of times, so what I'm going to talk about here is the process, hopefully the automated process that you use to build, deploy, test, and release your software. And a lot of times we spend a lot of time and energy on ceremonies and on the roles of folks within the Scrum process, the planning process within Agile in general. And this sort of back office capability is overlooked. And in my opinion, the single biggest inhibitor to doing Agile well is not having the right infrastructure in the background, not having the ability to continually integrate, not having the ability to automate your tests, not having the ability to return feedback to your customers, to your developers rather, quickly, so they can, in fact, quickly fix problems. Why those problems are, how they were thinking when they created the problem is still in their head, right? To return a defect to somebody 2 or 3 weeks later, way more costly for them to think, what was I thinking? Why did I do that? If they can return it to them very quickly, we can solve the problem really quickly and with much less expense, right? So the way I generally think about the Agile process is there are a number of disciplines in play here. We've talked about some of them. Inspect and adapt, sort of the idea of measuring so you can improve. The idea of grooming a backlog of requirements, building a release plan, and using that release plan to drive the development work, right? That all is absolutely key, but at the bottom of that is the ideas around continuous integration, DevOps, which is sort of the cultural change of bringing your developers and your operations folks together so they're working together. So there are fewer handoffs, and there is a shared accountability for getting a working product into the hands of your customer and having it be a high-quality product. And of course, continuous delivery, and for some organizations that are advanced, continuous deployment. The idea that I can, in a largely automated fashion, move from ideation to development to approval by my product owner to release to my end user in a very fast fashion. So it's a little bit of a complicated graphic. Even though it's complicated, it's a simplification, so bear with me. The idea here is that we aren't going to wait to do integration late in the process. We aren't going to have developers working and not pulling their work they've done together, and we're not going to have a non-working piece of software for long periods of time in this process. Our developers are going to pull the latest working build from the version control system. Developers are in green there, right? They're going to make small iterative changes. These are changes that need to be committed back to version control at least daily, hopefully much more frequently than that, right? They're not going to commit that change back into version control until they've run a personal build, so since they've smoke tested it in their development environment. So we aren't going to commit something that doesn't work and break the build, right? So we have some reasonable expectation that this work that this developer did is going to work. We're going to commit it to version control. Our continuous integration server is pulsing that version control solution and is going to run what we call the commit stage. It's going to build, it's going to test, it's going to run a not comprehensive testing, but it's going to test, do a limited amount of testing, and going to produce the binaries, store those binaries in an artifact repository. Those binaries are then deployed to environments, hopefully environments that are very similar, using a deployment process and build scripts that are very, very similar. What we're trying to do here is remove variability. We're trying to use automation to take this and create cycle time reductions. We're trying to make sure we do the testing that we think is going to most likely generate a defect in that commit stage. And if we don't pass there, we return to the developer in that feedback loop immediately. So we don't waste time. We don't have that transportation cost of moving software through this process unless we have some confidence after that commit stage that it's good software, right? And the same thing happens as we move through the process. As we move through our next set of testing, we're going to return that software to our developer team if we don't have success, right? The idea behind this is by the time you go to do a release, you'll have run this process hundreds, maybe of thousands of times, right? So the idea that you're going to have this stressful release event, the idea is that we're going to mitigate that largely. Because we're not only going to control the software in version control, we're going to control the build process, we're going to control the environments, we're going to control the virtualization, setup of our virtualized environments, we're going to set up the data, we're going to control the database scripts. So there's a lot of version control, there's a lot of work, but the benefit of this is we have a repeatable, predictable process for going to release, right? We reduce cycle times, we improve quality. These are core concepts that are part of Lean. This is important, and I think something that's often overlooked. I personally think this set of solutions, especially if you're going to do Agile acquisition, and I am going to maybe engage different vendors or developers to do different parts of my solution. This is what gives me the ability to have code base stored in a stable, centralized place so that if I do have to make a change with a developer or a vendor, I have that software maintained somewhere safe, right? We can plug a new vendor in. I'm oversimplifying, but they can pick up that software. We don't have to migrate that software from a developer's environment or an integrator's environment to some other developer or integrator's environment. All right, the last item I'm going to talk about is focus on team. So we saw earlier that with Lean, we really do focus on building up our team, enabling our team to be successful. We do focus on coaching and on process improvement. And the idea here is that we're going to move from functional silos where we have responsibility to a place where we have accountability, where we're going to measure the success not in terms of whether or not we, not in terms of whether we did our part of the process correctly, but whether the whole team did what they needed to do to deliver something valuable at the end. So it's moving from silos to collaboration, moving from handoffs to a common goal, moving away from finger pointing, to be frank, right? This is the idea here. With shorter cycle times, we don't have a focus on task, we have a focus on value delivery. And this is philosophically something that's necessary. I'll tell you that I've been doing this sort of work here for 4 or 5 years, and this, quite honestly, is what makes this work fun. I mean, I really enjoy working as part of a team, being collaborative, getting in a room and sparring with folks about how best to do something, how best to deliver a solution. That to me is really fun. I think for most people that's pretty fun. That's where you get to introduce a little bit of innovation and inventiveness into your daily job, and that makes work fun. And so this is not a burden. This is a great thing, I think, to think about when you're thinking about going down this road. And the last slide is just, it really is a change in the way we lead. We aren't command and control, we aren't directive, we really do need to be working together. We need to do what we say, we need to lead by example. We need to kind of move away from management by hierarchy of fear or whatever, to something where we're all working together and collaborating. And this is The Captain's Leadership it's a book, Best Damn Ship in the Navy. I think it's a great book if you want to read. It's just sort of lessons learned running or commanding a ship in the Navy. I think the lessons are just absolutely applicable to what we do every day with Agile and with Lean. And just to wrap up, I mean, I think where we want to go is elevate the team. Make this, if you can, make this work fun. Reduce WIP. Focus on reducing WIP, improving quality, and reducing waste. These are all Lean ideas. They all are, in fact, exactly what we're trying to achieve with Agile. They are the business case for Agile. And so there's great connections here. And to me, that's provides a bit of grounding for the Agile work. It's evidence that we can take concepts that have been long proven in the manufacturing industry. We can apply them. They have a basis that's proven. These concepts work. These ideas work. We just have a different use case here. We're applying them in a slightly different way, but it's the same ideas, the same values, the same principles. And good luck to you. I hope that works. I hope that was helpful to you. If there's any questions, I'd be glad to kind of answer those. I don't know where we are on time, actually, but trying to stay in my time box. All done? All right, well, thank you very much, guys. Appreciate it.